Hi everyone. So this week we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and you're going to have a lot of opportunity in class to work on some projects and a DBQ. And with that in mind, I wanted to provide a brief lecture on some of the topics that are very important to all of those assignments. Most notably, the rise of urban America, cities, and how the urban culture is really going to create a new modern American culture and the important role that immigration plays in that. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to do this in about 15 minutes. The rise of urbanization in America from 1860 to 1900 is really dramatic. And if you look at these numbers, I think they speak for themselves. But one particular city that I like to focus on is Chicago, particularly Chicago, which is a Midwestern city. And you might think of Frederick Jackson Turner and the frontier thesis that we talked about in class a little bit. The idea that America, much of its culture was born out of taming the Wild West as opposed to being some European tradition or taking our ideas from Europe. Frederick Jackson Turner said that we were more forged from taming the harsh American West. With that in mind, it's interesting to look at Chicago and to see the important role that Chicago is playing in American history and just the amazing growth. It really is the quintessential example of the growing American city. Um, where are we going to put all of these new urban residents? It's interesting to note that there was a contest in New York City to come up with a new place that would house all of these new residents, and the winner was a designer who came up with this idea known as the dumbbell tenements. On a side note, you can see why it's got its name. It kind of looks, the design looks a little bit like a dumbbell. I find it so interesting that recently Michael Bloomberg had a contest for an architect to design a micro apartment, an apartment under 400 square feet that would accommodate the growing population and expense of city living. So fascinating that there'd be a contest, about 120 years ago, and just recently we would have another. You can see why they're called dumbbell tenements, and these were all made of wood. If there was a fire here, like the Great Chicago Fire of the late 1890s, you can imagine how devastating this would be. And in general, this problem with fires was just one example of the problem that cities were dealing with the growing infrastructure. So you had all of these people. I want us to go back to this chart. Look at this huge growth of cities. So Chicago, 10 times, 15 times the number of people are living in Chicago in a 40-year period. What does that do to things like sewage and fire and police and crime and education? So the need to meet the growing infrastructure and the inability, really, of cities to meet the growing infrastructure is going to cause a lot of urban problems, fires, most notably crime, to name just a few. Where did this growing population came from? It did not come entirely from natural growth or even people uh, moving into cities. It came from immigration. And why do immigrants come to America? I'm just going to rattle this off. Immigrants come to America for the same reason that they did in the 1600s. And there's a little mnemonic device that we talked about: God, gold, and government. So the idea is gold. Americans come, or I should say Europeans, or people from all over the world come to America for economic opportunity. There's overcrowding in Europe. There's tremendous poverty in Europe. They come to America hoping, those rumors that the streets are paved with gold. They're coming to America for economic opportunity. The second G, God, religious freedom. There's tremendous amount of religious intolerance in certain countries throughout the world, and people come to America for religious freedom. And lastly, the third G, government. People come to America for political freedom and political opportunity. Things like inexpensive steerage. Some of us, probably all of us, have seen the movie Titanic. You might think of the scenes where Leonardo DiCaprio is in the hull of the ship with the poor passengers. That type of ticket would be called steerage, and it was much more affordable than any other passage to America had been, and it allowed poorer people to make their way to America. So these are all the things that led to the increase in immigration in the late 1800s. I like this cartoon. I'm going to show you a couple cartoons in this presentation. I like this cartoon because it illustrates, it's 1880, and we're going to note that it's right around this time period that there's a dramatic change in attitudes and policy in America. So prior to 1880, no oppressive taxes, no expensive kings, no compulsory military service, free education, free land, free speech, free ballot. We talked about the Homestead Act. Here's Uncle Sam with his arms wide open. This cartoon illustrates the idea that America was open-armed and welcoming to immigrants. But as you probably, well, let me talk about this first. Two types of immigrant groups that we talk about. Old immigrants, and this is kind of a soft date, but it's just one to kind of give us a sense of when this shift happens. We're going to say prior to 1875 is a good year to kind of set, and that's because that's the first year that an immigration law was passed in the United States. And what are the demographics of old immigrants? What do old immigrants look like? They're Protestant for the most part. They're English speaking. They speak and write English. They came to America with a skill set. And sometimes we might think of this term WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This is Boston, 1780s. These are the people who came to America prior to 1875, and we're going to think of them as old immigrants. If we have old immigrants, we're going to have new immigrants. So when we talk about new immigrants, what are we talking about? Southern Eastern Europe. And I love this unit because it relates. So many of us can go home and talk to our parents or our grandparents about this. If you're from Italy, if you're from Poland, if you're from Greece, if you're from Eastern Europe or Russia, this might be your history that we're talking about. You're not Protestant. Well, you might be Protestant, but new immigrants weren't Protestant. They're Catholic, Jewish, Greek Orthodox. They came to America with very little skills. They're illiterate, at least in terms of English, they're illiterate. And, oops, I thought I had one more there. What we're going to see is these new immigrants, as we can imagine, are going to face a tremendous amount of discrimination and prejudice. When we talk about immigrants and immigration in America, it's such an integral part of American history. Oftentimes there's two ways of looking at it. The melting pot theory and the salad bowl theory. The melting pot theory is one you're probably more familiar with. And this is the idea that new immigrants come to America, and within a generation or two, they've assimilated into American culture. So the grandchild doesn't speak the language that his grandfather and grandmother spoke. They're very much assimilated to American culture. But also, America has changed because of their introduction to America. That it might be seen in food, it might be seen in traditions, it might be seen in parades and in things like Columbus Day Parade or the St. Patrick's Day Parade. Um, that is the melting pot theory. And it's the idea that with increased immigration or as immigrants come to America, that they diffuse into the American culture and both the immigrants and American culture change. That's the melting pot theory. And it's a very popular theory. A lot of people like to talk about cultural pluralism, sometimes referred to as salad bowl theory. And like a salad bowl, individual ethnic groups retain their cultural heritage, and they don't mix into society and they don't assimilate into society quickly. They hold on to their cultural heritage, and that cultural heritage becomes more of like a quilt of America rather than a melting pot. Like I said, that's sometimes referred to as cultural pluralism or the salad bowl theory. And really, neither is right or wrong. It's just two different ways of looking at the impact that immigration had on the United States. Well, one undeniable way or thing of looking at immigration is racism and prejudice. This is a horrible cartoon that I love to show because it just illustrates the amount of racism that was going on. This person right here is supposed to be an Irish immigrant, drawn in a very stereotypically way of the time. They often drew Irish immigrants as gorillas, So this is a horrible picture, and this is a Chinese immigrant. And of course, the Irish and the Chinese were very important immigrants in terms of building the Transcontinental Railroad. But here they are swallowing Uncle Sam in just a horrific scene. And here they are, completing their act. And in the end, Uncle Sam has become this monstrous mix of Irish and Chinese immigrant. I speak as the cartoonist here. Obviously, a very racist cartoon. I have here written the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party was a party of the 1850s that was opposed to immigration. They actually get their name because they were often associated with groups that would engage in violence against immigrants. And when the police would come and ask, who beat up this immigrant or who burned down this immigrant house, the answer would be, we don't know nothing. And this political party literally got their name from those types of activities. So discrimination and racism and popular opinion is going to lead to government action. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the policies that the United States had. Nativism. Nativism is the term that many people of the Know Nothing Party would have prescribed to. It means native-born Americans who are opposed to new immigrants. And I have a picture of the KKK here, who obviously were known for these feelings. So as I look at the clock here, we got about 4 minutes before I get cut off, so I'm going to try to go quickly through these policies. Here's a cartoon. This cartoon is actually critical of the discrimination that Chinese immigrants faced, and it's a criticism of it. It's not popularizing the idea, but after the Transcontinental Railroad was built and Chinese immigrant labor was no longer needed, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbid Chinese immigration. A few years later, the Gentleman's Agreement would be reached between Teddy Roosevelt and the nation of Japan. The agreement said that America, which at the time was segregating Japanese students, would no longer segregate Japanese students, but that Japan would make every effort to limit or greatly reduce the number of Japanese immigrants to the United States. So Asian countries are being the immigrants from Asian countries are being greatly reduced. What about Southern and Eastern Europe? We're going to see a series of quota laws. There's a bunch of them, and I'm just going to show you this quick little graph here that I think shows you the impact of these quota laws. Essentially, quota laws set quotas on the number of immigrants that could come from every country, and Southern and Eastern European countries had very limited quotas. As you can see, prior to 1921, the amount of immigrants from Southern and Eastern and Asian countries were, huge. A great majority of the immigration came from those areas of the world. After 1921, it's greatly reduced. 1924 was even a more strict quota law. And in 1929, although it's called the National Origins Act, it's essentially a quota law. I mean, it's a good way of thinking of it, and reduced even further. It's interesting to note your own personal story. If you are the relatives of immigrants, you might want to find out when your relatives came to America. If you're from Southern and Eastern Europe, it might be before 1921, and I love it when history kind of makes sense like that. Last but not least, I want to show you a very famous cartoon that I just think is really powerful. Sometimes people don't see this, sometimes people see it right away, but here, these people would be best described as nativists. They're native-born Americans. They seem very prosperous. They seem wealthy. And here they are. They have strong anti-immigration feelings. Here's the guy coming right off the boat, right? Probably all of his belongings on his back. And he's being told, no, we don't want you. And what sometimes goes unnoticed is the shadows that these wealthy nativists are casting. These are the shadows of their forefathers, and they too were immigrants. So I love this cartoon. I love showing it in class, and even though we're having a non-traditional class this week with this online lecture and a few activities to complete, I wanted to make sure I shared that cartoon with you as well. All right, with that in mind, I hope this lecture helped. You also have your book, of course, that can help you find any information that you need on this topic.